Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm again joined by Keith Preston at Ruminations and Swithun Dobson, here to discuss the dynamic between oppression or bellyaching. Is anybody truly oppressed in the first world in the 21st century? So why don't you sort of sketch out your thoughts on this, Keith?
Okay, well, what's interesting when we look at our contemporary politics is we see that we largely have rival camps claiming to be oppressed or claiming to have been oppressed. And we see that on both the left and the right. I think that's particularly true in the context of American politics. When we look at the mainstream American politics, the rhetoric that comes from the left and the right, the blue tribe and the red tribe and their various media outlets and political and cultural spokespeople, what you see is that there's always some kind of claim of victimology. We see that on the right, we see there's a claim that, quote unquote, normal people or traditionally, hardworking, God-fearing, whatever people are being oppressed by weird cultural elites and liberals and the media and the educational system and things like that. And then on the left, we see the same thing, of course. We see this wide assortment of groups and individuals claiming victimology, claiming that they've somehow been victimized in some particular way. And of course, the two sides view each other's claims of being oppressed as ridiculous. The examples would be that on one hand, the left will say, well, the problem with the right is the right are just groups in society that were once dominant and hegemonic, and they simply resent having to share space with groups that were formerly excluded and marginalized and have now been more integrated into the mainstream. And of course, the right will say precisely the opposite. They will say the left's claims of victimology are based on things that happened generations ago or even centuries ago. And in reality, a lot of the so-called left-wing victim groups are privileged people that are simply trying to use their victimology as a card through which they can score some brownie points and gain advantages for themselves. And this is the dialogue that goes on back and forth constantly between the left and right political interest groups in the United States. And I'm not as familiar with other societies, but it seems to be a similar process in much of the developed world in various ways and on different levels. Maybe the groups vary differently depending on the culture and political and economic circumstances, but it seems to be a very similar process that unfolds. So that leads to the interesting question of whether anyone is truly oppressed or who is truly oppressed. On the left, you'll hear people say, well, we're against all forms of oppression and things of that nature. And you see similar rhetoric coming from certain sectors of the right. For example, with the recent lockdowns that have been happening because of the pandemic, you see people on the right having protests against the lockdown saying this is fascism that's come to America and things like that. So you see a lot of that coming from both sides. So the big question is who, if anyone, has a legitimate claim of being oppressed? When we look at history, we can see circumstances where it looks like people were oppressed from the vantage point of hindsight. We can look at things like slavery. We can look at things like religious persecution, burning people at the stake. We can look at ethnic cleansing, genocide, a lot of different things like that have certainly existed in past societies and that we still see in some places today, and mostly in the underdeveloped world. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, we still see witch burnings, at least on the margins of society, and the killings of albinos and things like that. In some other parts of the world, we see genuine religious persecution, for example, in some of the Islamist ruled countries and so forth. And in Other places we even still see remnants of slavery, or they still practice slavery. For example, in Libya now, in the post-Gaddafi era, slavery's made a comeback. But do we have anything like that that's comparable in the Western world? And different people raise different claims about that. Some people say, well, abortion is really just the Holocaust of the unborn. And I've also heard people make that argument pertaining to animals, that really it's the animals now who are suffering genocide and persecution. And there are other points of view that are perhaps comparable. So, I could offer my own thoughts on this, but I guess will throw this out for everyone else to think about. Who, if anyone, is actually oppressed in modern developed societies. By the way, Todd, is there something wrong with the camera hookup? I'm not able to get my camera on.
Yeah, well, it doesn't show that you have a camera, but we can all hear you.
Okay, because I see that your camera's not on either.
Well, you might be able to turn it. Okay, you can turn it on and off at the bottom of the screen where it says center right has mute, and then start camera, turn off camera.
Okay.
So.
Okay, my camera should be okay. My camera. Not that I guess it doesn't matter, but it says it's on, but then it's not on. So I don't know what the issue with that is. But
yeah, the one thing that I think, to jump off what you said, is what is oppression? Well, one of the problems is you often hear when the right complains about being oppressed by the left, the left will say justice to those who are privileged is often seen as oppression. Well, there's two problems with this argument. Civilization brought to the savage is also seen as oppression by the savage. I mean, you could just as much say that from the point of view of the right. But furthermore, if there's a fourth way revolution, sort of what the Russian Eurasianists like Dugin talk about, and they seek to overthrow the woke coalition, they could then say justice to the woke coalition is perceived as oppression. So the problem is it's completely open-ended and doesn't actually solve any of the issues. Another problem with defining oppression is a lot of times people will say they're oppressed if they don't get what they want 100% of the time. Now, that on its face is ridiculous because nobody gets what they want 100% of the time. But if that's your attitude, then you always believe yourself to be oppressed. And second of all, I do find it really odd that the people see moral intuitions have a certain implication. So if you're going to be a far left environmentalist and say that animals are being genocided, then ipso facto, you're going to have to say that so are babies, because any justification you might bring to defend the eating of cows would, by implication, defend unborn fetuses. And in fact, I did read an essay years ago by an ELF member who did say that, which is interesting. Most wouldn't. But I think one of the problems is defining oppression itself. Getting back to what we talked about in an earlier podcast, we have people that have a fundamentally different view of the good, and this sort of fragmentation is accelerating. And so what some people view as good, other people view as evil or are indifferent to. And so because we've lost a common sense of what is good and what is bad, we've lost a common understanding of what is oppression and what isn't oppression. The closest thing one might have is people being under the rule of completely arbitrary laws. That's the closest thing that everybody might agree on is oppression. And I guess in that case, everybody's oppressed because the U.S. federal government has a lot of arbitrary laws that don't make sense and affect people without even probably having those considerations in mind by the lawmakers. But I think also oppression has a connotation of something like slavery or genocide or physical assault, which in general doesn't exist in the first world. So oppression, if it does exist, if we can even find a common agreement, is a lot less than it used to be. I think I'll hand that off to you, right, Ruminations?
I think that very likely, in some way, everyone is always oppressed. And I mean that unironically. I don't think it's a feature of this society or that society. I think that no matter what particular identity you might relate to, it's always going to have some corresponding environment where that identity is systematically mistreated in such a way that when you are on the inside of that environment, there is a legitimate feeling of either anxiety or resentment or what have you that other people are not going to be able to pick up on as readily if they don't experience it. So, for example, it's going to be difficult for, say, a middle-aged woman who's never been to college to relate to, say, what it's like to be a right-leaning white man on a modern university college campus. And likewise, I think that even with groups who have some systematic advantages with respect to things like affirmative action or anti-discrimination laws, like, let's say, Black Americans, that it is true that nevertheless, if you are a person like that and you go into an environment, say a small town that is mostly white and is kind of mistrusting of outsiders, you'll find people who are a source of aggravation or irritation. And from the inside, I think it often is experienced as as an eminently unpleasant situation. On the other hand, if you operate from that premise that everyone is oppressed in one way or another in every society always, then you have to be very much in perspective and in proportion as to how far you're willing to go to address any given instance of oppression. Because almost every remedy for oppression is just a worse form of oppression. So it's mostly prudent to take these things in measure. So, for example, if you take something like Black Americans, as Jordan Peterson has pointed out, the thing that they, aside from the media and the academic culture and political correctness stirring them up, one of the sociological foundations of their resentment is the fact simply that they do less well compared to the average middle-class white person. But they're still like the third or fourth wealthiest demographic of humans on the planet or something. So in other words, it is a kind of situation where if you imagine that you are working in an office and you have a good job and it probably pays better than the average job, but if for some reason you are getting paid less than everyone else in the office, whether you're justified in resenting that or not, I think that there is a kind of emotional reaction of this is on some level not fair, or I'm not being given seniority for some reason. So I think that a lot of it is circumstantial, and this is where I also get frustrated with socialist types who complain about things like first world problems. Well, okay, if your cell phone is broken, that may very well be a first world problem, but at the same time, I mean, you've become accustomed to having a cell phone and then suddenly it's not there. Whether that's a just complaint or not, it's a kind of viscerally present complaint. It's almost automatic. So I just think that on the one hand, I believe that what really is the issue with the complaints about oppression is that they are not proportionate in terms of their response, because as much aggravation as a man on a feminist college campus or a Black man in a small white town has with this or that cultural situation, the question is always, is the solution being proposed in proportion to the original grievance? And when you look at how well minorities have been treated in modern first world countries compared to anything in the past, as you've pointed out in the past, Todd, that it's unprecedented in history for one race to say go to war to the effect of freeing another race. Yet this is the kind of attention that minorities within America have experienced. And so is the sort of reverse discrimination that's being leveled in the name of addressing these grievances proportionate to the problem? And I would say no. So I'm against oppression culture, but on the other hand, I guess you could say that I believe in the heartfelt nature of the complaints, because I think that everyone is just internally complaining all the time. So it's not so much that the oppression doesn't exist, it's just that the response is far out of proportion and doesn't take into account the fact that everyone's being oppressed all the time.
Yeah, Swithun, thoughts?
I would generally agree with your assessment, Todd. I think the issue really comes down to what actually constitutes oppression. What it seems to be, well, unless you have a good idea of the good or something on those lines, then really oppression is essentially, as I think it's right, Ruminations pointed out, whenever you don't get what you want, whenever your will is frustrated, then in a sense you have been oppressed. You are a masochist as opposed to being a sadist, to put it in Jean-Paul Sartre's terms. So that would seem to be the only sort of consistent way of looking at it, unless you were going to take a specific moral stance on it. And if you were to take just that more a moralist position of frustrating the will, you could distinguish between kind of legal force and just general societal disapproval and sort of ostracism within certain groups. And for the sake of argument here, I will focus primarily on the legal situation, because at the moment, in most cases, social ostracism, you may find it more difficult to get a job, or you may not have as many friends, but no one's going to come and take your stuff or put you in jail. So the question then arises, who is the most oppressed? Well, obviously, and almost by definition, the criminal is oppressed, because it's the criminal who is obviously frustrated in his will and legally prevented from acting out his will as he sees fit. So we have murderers, etc. They, of course, are frustrated and they are oppressed in a certain sense, because they can't murder people they want to. Now, in general, you could go, well, that's not really oppression because they're kind of bad, so we kind of get rid of them. But then you could take the view of victimless crimes and you could claim, well, it's the drug users and the prostitutes who are the most oppressed, because they're engaging in what you could argue are victimless crimes, where there is no identifiable victim, yet the police will come up and arrest them. They may engage in shootouts with them, etc., and so therefore are oppressed. Now, let's now take it, though, to the more specific question at hand, which is red versus blue. And you have something similar in England as you do in America, although probably not as polarized as it is in America quite at present. So who is legally more oppressed amongst the blue tribe and the red tribe? Well, it would seem on a legal basis that it's the red tribe who is more oppressed, although I will clarify that in a second. Clearly, with anti-discrimination laws, which are legally enforced, they are clearly always against the red tribe. I mean, that's clearly the case, and that's how they were designed. It wasn't designed so everyone would get fair treatment. It was to raise up the black man and the brown man. That is the purpose of them. They were never intended for any sort of equality in any real sense. So related to this, you have the persecution. Well, you can say persecution. That's probably overstating it slightly. You have the attacks on sort of bakers who refuse to create cakes for gay weddings, and they are fined. And I don't know if they're ever a jail sentence for half of this stuff, but it's certainly fines. And it's clearly the case if someone went up and said, I want a happy Holocaust Day cake, that I seriously don't think anyone will would consider that prosecutable if the baker refused to go, you know what, Happy Holocaust Day is probably not something I want to make. So these laws were always intended really as something to persecute the, well, not persecute, as I say, persecute again. It's something to advance a particular ideology and use legal force to do so. Although, now, so on the cultural level, probably the anti-discrimination laws to a larger extent than anything else. On economic laws, though, you could make the claim, and I think would be fair, that the sort of working man, as it were, is oppressed in the sense that the economic game is stacked against him, in which the corporations have legal privileges. They have had land grants historically, and it kind of perpetuates sort of economic inequality. Now, it may not be the case in that sense that they are directly have legal force against them, but it is the legally violent actions from the state which perpetuates their, as it were, economic servitude. But even in a more direct sense, you have occupational licensure, zoning, etc., which are direct legal frustrations of sort of small time operations. I think here probably you could argue that any sort of sole trader is, in a sense, one of the more economically oppressed groups. They don't have limited liability. They have the state grant of that, and then they have all the different legal hurdles that they must jump through to become legally operable, which again, which are sort of, will be fined, or other things like that would happen to them if they broke them. So on the legal aspect of frustration of the will, it would seem to be anybody who is not culturally sort of progressive are the ones who would be more on the end of that. Although, again, in historical terms, it's not huge. And then you could make the case on the economic end of small business. I think is probably, I wouldn't say agree with Rand. It's not the big businessman, as it were, who is oppressed, as it were. It is rather the small man who is that. And just one last thing. I mean, if you were to take that the unborn are persons, then obviously on magnitude that would be the greatest oppression. Although that would presuppose they were persons, and sort of so you'd have to go down that debate. But if they were, then that would clearly be the biggest form of sort of will frustration. Although you could make an argument to have a will as such, but you get the idea. So that would be my general take.
I think, to answer Keith's question, who is actually oppressed in the 21st century, I think the obvious demographic is children. Now, that can be divided into two categories, the unborn and the born. So let's deal with the born first. I think most of us would agree with Rothbard's critique in The Ethics of Liberty that state child services are atrocious, and that children that are given up for adoption and foster care are often horribly mistreated and abused. And really, there's no voice for them. So if a woman is mistreated, we got the Me Too movement, we got alimony, we got lawyers that'll come to her aid. Children have no advocates. If state functionaries or caregivers, like working at daycare, private daycare, or even parents abuse children, they have no means of redress. And ultimately, I think a sort of Lockean proviso should hold, and the idea that you should give your children at least as much as you took. So if you are going to engage in activity that will likely produce children, then it's really a matter of justice whether the child is taken care of or not. And that could be independent of are you the one doing it? I mean, I suppose you could give it up to adoption, but given the way that adoption is carried out today, that's kind of dangerous. And with child trafficking, with human trafficking, one of the main demographics is underage children, because of the pedo market. So this is totally independent of the question of abortion. And again, there's absolutely no, for the children is a throwaway line that Bill Clinton used. So for the children, we murder 20 children at Waco, or we starve 500,000 children in Iraq. That's not for the children. That's a joke. Really for the children, nobody really has that as a political goal. And since they really are voiceless, I think that would be one case of oppression. And then furthermore, I don't see how there can be any consistent left-wing objection to the pro-life movement, because if you're going to say that animals have rights, and that does tend to be the trajectory of the left, animals are non-rational sentient beings. So the fact that a fetus is non-rational is apparently irrelevant. Any argument that you could provide for giving rights to animals would ipso facto also apply to fetuses. There's no non-arbitrary way to disapply that. So I would say that even on a left-wing model of oppression, though the right, I wouldn't have to sell this at all, children are probably the most oppressed group, and that's regardless of race. We also have sex and gender-specific abortions, which should make the left up in arms. In India and China, they have sex-specific abortions, which they don't even care about. So it's like, I remember reading one feminist who said the problem was they didn't abort enough boys, as if maybe they should abort less girls, which is just mind-boggling, but whatever. It really just goes to, but I would say that I think you can make a case for both right and left, that children are ultimately the most oppressed demographic today. And I'll hand it over to you, Keith. What are your thoughts on that?
One thing that I think it's interesting, and it's one reason why I wanted to do this program, and that is all three of you have offered, I think, somewhat different views on who counts as the oppressed. I think Swithun has, as I would have thought, has articulated very well a fairly standard libertarian perspective on what counts as oppression and what doesn't. And of course, you, Todd, I know that you are strongly pro-life, so I'm not entirely surprised by your views either. And right, Ruminations, I agree with much of what he said in his own from his own perspective. I think it's such an interesting topic because it's something that's it's really the foundation of much of the discourse that we have in our own society. And I know in my own debates with people from the left, one ongoing dispute that I've had with a lot of people is that they will say things like, well, the problem with your outlook is that you view oppression issues as nothing more than competition between special interest groups. Or you simply downplay the significance of oppression issues and things of that nature. And from their perspective, that would probably be correct. I remember years ago, probably in the early 90s, I came across an article. It was in one of the Washington newspapers. I don't know if it was the Post or one of the others. By Richard Greiner, the late Richard Greiner, who was something of a neoconish kind of syndicated columnist, kind of a George Will type or something like that. But at the time, he was criticizing all of the oppression claims that come from the left, saying, well, if you really take this seriously, you're going to have to say that oppressed minorities are something like 372% of the population, because if you say, well, all workers are oppressed, and then all blacks are oppressed, and all women are oppressed, and all homosexuals are oppressed, and all whatever age group is oppressed, and whatever all disabled people, and then you've got multiple people who belong to at least two of those categories, and some people belong to all of them, then really what you're saying is that the ranks of the oppressed are probably multiple times the actual population. And I think that he meant that as a joke. He meant that as sarcasm and ridicule. But I think that the way the trajectory of the left has gone since then is that has largely been the perspective that the left has adopted. Where when I look through the material of these social justice warrior types, and I see the things that they claim are oppression. Nowadays they talk about weightism, about how fat people are oppressed, and looksism. Not every woman can be Miss America, so there's looks oppression. And then there's, of course, ageism, and which is oppression of somebody who's of the wrong age, although they can't really seem to agree whether it's children or young adults or old people or whomever who are the most oppressed. And then, of course, the various sexual configurations like transphobia and things like that, homophobia, and then they keep adding other categories as well. And then, of course, they talk about how there's all these different levels of oppression. Like there's not only obvious things like genocide, but then there's microaggressions, and then manspreading is a form of oppression of women, and white-splaining and mansplaining and these kinds of things. So they have all these hierarchies of oppression. And it seems to me that what they do with all of that stuff is they, even in its most well-intentioned forms, I think a lot of that kind of stuff amounts to the little boy who cried wolf story. It's always seemed to me that when they take claims of oppression and exaggerate them into these, fairly wild categories, then they shouldn't be surprised when people don't take any claims of that type seriously. When you start saying, for example, that if a white person has dreadlocks, dreadlock hairstyle, well, they're really oppressing black people because they're oppressing they're appropriating their culture or something like that. Although you could really say that American black people who have dreadlocks, they're actually appropriating the culture of the Jamaicans. They're oppressing the Jamaicans, something like that. Or African Americans who adopt African names, well, they're appropriating the culture of Africa. There's all kinds of ways you can spin these kinds of things. So I tend to, on one hand, look at a lot of the claims that are raised by the left as far as what constitutes oppression and what doesn't as being somewhat dubious. And I know I had another debate once with a left-wing guy, a far left-wing guy, and he was saying, and I was criticizing the state, and he was saying, well, the state's not the only form of oppression. That a neighborhood can be oppressive, and a church can be oppressive, and people can be psychologically oppressed, and there can be oppression in the family, and as if strict parents are the same thing as the state invading other countries and killing hundreds of thousands of people and things like that, or an exclusionary neighborhood that doesn't want any weird people there, that's somehow comparable to genocide. They have this way of conflating concepts that I think approaches a fairly absurd proportions. Now, to be fair, while I see a lot of that kind of stuff coming from the left, I have found somewhat similar things coming from the right as well. I've from a lot of earlier it was said, well, there are people who think they're oppressed if they can't have what they want all the time, and I have found people like that on the right. I for example, I'm 100% so pro Second Amendment, right to bear arms, but I found people on the right who think they're being genocided if they can't have a howitzer mounted on the back of a tank in their driveway or something like that. Or I'm 100% pro freedom of religion, and I do think things like these gay wedding cake cases are somewhat alarming, because what that does show is that the state is not showing respect for the concept of freedom of conscience, which is fundamental to ideas of what, like, the First Amendment and all that is supposed to be. But at the same time, I don't see that religious communities are being oppressed if they can't broadcast a prayer over a loudspeaker in Walmart, or something like that. And I have come across people who think that way. I don't know that white people are being oppressed merely by the existence of immigrants. Now, you can certainly argue that, I think the left has an issue on the other side. They think that any and all restrictions on immigration amount to Auschwitz or something like that. But I don't know that the mere existence of immigrants is oppression either. So that's also an issue that I see coming from the right that I think is perhaps problematic. But in terms of what I would consider to be genuinely serious forms of oppression that might exist in modern societies, in the case of the United States, I say American foreign policy is a form of oppression that's inflicted on other societies. if you look at the death count that's been generated by American foreign policy, I'd say that's fairly significant. Now, we could argue, well, some of those places were no prizes to live in to start with, Iraq or Libya or Syria or Afghanistan. But I don't know that the American participation in conflicts in those places has reduced the death count. I'm pretty sure that it will that it's increased the death count significantly. So that might be one form. As far as in our domestic society in the United States, I tend to agree with what Todd said initially, in the sense that probably it's the sheer arbitrariness of law, in the sense that we now have at the federal level in the United States, just at the federal level, something like 5,000 things that are considered criminal offenses that you can be imprisoned for. If all of us collectively tried to brainstorm, okay, what are 5,000 things you can go to jail for? It would be hard to think of them all. But I've heard of people being sent to jail for having shrimp packaged in the wrong kind of container and stuff like that. And that's just at the federal level. At the state and local level, you have similar problems, and you also have I think a lot of people from the libertarian camp emphasize criminal law, but there's also regulatory statutes that I think tend to be very extreme. And of course, violation of regulatory statutes can land you in criminal court, because if you don't comply with, say, civil sanctions that are imposed for violation of a regulatory statute, that can become a criminal offense. And there's a lot of blurring between administrative law and criminal law. In fact, I once read that there are something like 350,000 federal laws in the United States that theoretically you could end up in jail for if you violated them. All the different kinds of regulatory statutes that theoretically could carry some kind of criminal penalty, either directly or indirectly. And one of the hallmarks of totalitarianism classical totalitarianism of the 20th century was its arbitrariness. This idea that, well, the law is just whatever we say it is, and it may be different today than it was a year ago, but we don't need consistency. It's the whole Orwellian concept of we've always been at war with East Asia or whatever. I suppose that would be the most significant thing that I see happening in developed societies generally, is the way that which I think the issue there is that law has assumed the function of sort of being an all-purposes instrument that's used to solve all kinds of problems. It's not just something that's used for, say, maintaining civil order or reasonable regulations over things like public health and safety or preventing fraud and things like that. But the law, even the criminal law, is expected to be something that deals with every kind of social problem that there is. And in fact, you've seen people that are fairly mainstream raising this issue. I've seen some people from the right, like the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute and some of the more business-oriented groups from the right, I think are criticizing this in part because it's starting to impact the business community. And then I've seen people on the left. You have people like Michelle Alexander, who wrote the book, The New Jim Crow, that she's concerned about the racial disparities that you see in some of this. But I do think that's probably the most significant thing of this type if we wanted to look at something that we find in domestic societies. And I from what I've seen of other developed countries, it seems to be somewhat similar in the sense that we don't really have, as I said, we don't really have genocide. We don't really have slavery. We don't really have ethnic cleansing and full-blown religious persecution of the kind we might see in older societies or underdeveloped societies. But we do see this kind of arbitrariness that creeps into institutions in terms of institutional regulations and things like that. And I would argue that on the margins of society, we may have people that could, or at least from time to time, are subject to genuine oppression. If, for instance, in the United States back in the 90s, you had the massacre of the Branch Davidian religious community. Now you can argue, well, they contributed to that. Arguably they were engaging in behaviors that contributed to their own demise. But once again, as someone said before, is I think Right Rumination says, was the response proportional? And clearly it was not. And that was true of the around the same time. There was a family in rural Idaho, the Weavers. They were some kind of white nationalist, separatist or whatever, and they were attacked by the FBI, and there was essentially a murder of the mother in this particular family. And I would argue in those two instances, those were examples of religious and political oppression, that these were people who were targeted for who they were, not for what they did. Now, there may or may not have been things they did that contributed to the problem, but I think who they were was really the essence of the fate that they suffered. On the other end of the cultural spectrum, I do think there are some population groups that are subject to oppression, in the sense that the way that they are treated by the wider society is not proportional to any real or imaginary problems associated with them. Drug users would be one, and sex workers or prostitutes or whatever, as many libertarians will point out, is one. And also, I think there are some socioeconomic categories that overlap with different demographics that I think are where there's genuine oppression. One would be the Native Americans or the American Indians that are still living on reservations, where they really do live in the kinds of conditions you would find in underdeveloped societies. And you find white communities like that in Appalachia and places like that. You find some African American communities deep in the inner cities, perhaps some Hispanic communities where they're primarily migrant workers, and in some of these socioeconomic categories. So on the periphery, I'd say that the race and class oppression that the left talks about does exist, and some of the cultural oppression that leftists and libertarians talk about does exist. And on the right, as I said, I think that there is an alarming trend now towards repression based on political and religious beliefs, that the actual criminalization of political and religious beliefs simply because other people find it offensive. Like, I've heard of people who want to impose censorship on climate change denial, or the gay wedding cake issue was another one. Things like that. I think that hate speech laws are certainly problematic from that perspective. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
One thing I want to interject here as well is a form of oppression that I didn't think of yet, and this overlaps a bit with the critique of environmentalists like the Unabomber and Zerzan from C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. It's the sort of oppression of a generation in time over subsequent generations. This is from his lecture of The Abolition of Man. The latter point is not always sufficiently emphasized because those who write on social matters have not yet learned to imitate the physicists by always including time among the dimensions. In order to fully understand what man's power over nature, and therefore the power of some men over other men, really means, we must picture the race extended in time from the date of its emergence to that of its extinction. Each generation exercises power over its successors, and each, insofar as it modifies the environment bequeathed to it and rebels against tradition, resists and limits the power of its predecessors. This modifies the picture which is sometimes painted of progressive emancipation from tradition and progressive control of natural processes, resulting in a continual increase of human power. In reality, of course, if anyone age really attains by eugenics and scientific education the power to make its descendants what it pleases, all men who live after it are patients of that power. They are weaker, not stronger, for though we may have put wonderful machines in their hands, we have preordained how they are to use them. And if, as is almost certain, the age which has thus attained maximum power over posterity were also the age most emancipated from tradition, it would be engaged in reducing the power of its predecessors almost as dramatically as that of its successors. And we must also remember that quite apart from this, the later a generation comes, the nearer it lives to the date at which the species becomes extinct, the less power it will have in the forward direction because its subjects will be so few. There is therefore no question of power vested in the race as a whole, steadily growing as long as the race survives. The last man, far from being the heirs of power, will be of all men most subject to the dead hand of the great planners and conditioners, and will themselves exercise least power upon the future. Now that's a point that someone like the Unabomber and Zerzan would wholeheartedly agree with, but most people on the left, and I would argue on the right, don't seem to look at it from that point of view. And I think in one sense, those are the people that have the capacity to be the most oppressive if and when that generation were ever to come. Swithun, what are some of your thoughts on all this?
Sorry, brief tech issue. The way in which the future impacts on the past, something I hadn't thought of in this. Just another little messages. You could make the claim that the boomer generation are somewhat oppressive insofar as they seem to get the best of the economic situation in the post-war period. Retired on very large pensions, which are primarily paid for by the labor of the current workforce, who are younger. So that's certainly an interesting angle, which I hadn't thought of originally. On the children aspect, which you mentioned, Todd, you're definitely right with the oppression. One thing to remember as well, you got things like, the prohibition of child labor, for one thing, is now you can say, that they're not being forced to go into factories or whatever, but a lot of them, especially males, they're drugged in schools because they don't like sitting down for 8 hours a day in a room all day, and they are prohibited from working and doing something that they would find of value or of interest, and that's just entirely prevented for them. They're entirely prevented from doing so. I don't think they can be. I think the parents can be prosecuted for violating the child labor laws, or whoever employs them. The thing that they would end up doing is probably being sent to special schools, which is basically the same as a school, but with an even higher fence that they can't get out of. So that's one aspect of children. And Todd, you reminded me. You said, "What has anyone ever done for the children?" Well, one thing they did do was kill Jeffrey Epstein. That's probably the only thing you could argue anyone did for the children, although it probably wasn't for the children. So that's one thing that came to mind. And one thing I'd forgotten as well from my previous angle on the legal aspect of oppression is, yes, of the race aspect with the legal things. But also there's the sex aspects. So in England, you have like the Equal Pay Act. That wasn't so that certain male workers were paid the equal wages with other men who were working there who did the same job. It was all about increasing women's pay. As you've mentioned before, Me Too movement and the general way in which the legal system privileges women. They get lower jail sentences on average than men, and the whole of those sort of legal changes were to, I don't think they were to oppress men per se. That's untrue. I think rather it was a certain class of man who was trying to put the working class male in his place. I think that's more the dynamic that was taking place there, and then the extension of all the anti-discrimination stuff as well, such as you could argue to some extent the disabled oppress the non-disabled, or at least indirectly via the state. Small business owners have to put absurd ramps even though they have no disabled customers ever, which cost thousands upon thousands of pounds. So on the legal changes, it's certainly the case that I think the right or the red tribe are more correct. Although then the question is, well, is that the only form of oppression? Which is, of course, what they would respond with, as Keith has pointed out. Everything is oppression. There's cultural oppression, etc. And this is a way of just balancing it out. But if you were going to focus purely on the legal aspect, that's certainly the case. And as Keith reminded me, if you break sort of non-criminal civil offences, if you don't comply in respect to kind of packaging or appropriate wood, wording on your products, then eventually, if you don't comply, bailiffs come and take your stuff, or you could potentially be jailed. So that would be another aspect of oppression. And yes, externally, as Keith's point is big on foreign policy, and he's correct. You could argue that clearly that the obvious oppression is external and not internal, with the various wars that, the Western powers as such have been involved in from at least the Second World War, if not earlier in certain cases. So who is more oppressed, the blue tribe or the red tribe? If you're going on the legal aspects, it's clearly the red tribe. But if you want to take it in a broader sense, and you could argue, it's the blue tribe, except it isn't the blue tribe, because the blue tribe are upper middle class whites who have it really good out of the current economic system. So they aren't oppressed at all. Now, the traditional voting bloc could be, but they certainly aren't.
All right, Ruminations.
Before closing, I do want to say a little bit more about the definition of oppression, because I neglected to define oppression as I was using it when I said that everyone is in some way oppressed. And I didn't mean that as a joke. I really do believe that in a sense. But the real point that I was making is that oppression is inevitable. What I see oppression as is just a certain inevitable expression of how society has to express control. So that even in a libertarian society, there's always some mechanism of control. I see oppression as being control that is contrary to the pursuit of truth, or contrary to any conception of some systemized legal apparatus. That is, oppression is arbitrary control. It's control that's meant to affect a certain outcome regardless of the process involved. So if you're in a room of, say, feminists who want to bully you for having, say, a pro-life position, well, that's maybe a mild form of oppression, but it is, qualitatively speaking, oppression, I suppose, if they're not really caring about the social rules or not really caring about any kind of procedure, but they just want to get that outcome that they want. Similarly, it could even be oppression in the other direction. If there's a lone feminist in a room of, say, evangelical Christians, and they don't really care about any kind of procedure, they just want to essentially enforce the social norms in terms of opinion. That is basically whenever control becomes chronically unreasonable in the name of affecting some kind of ideological outcome. You might say, I just view the room as being sort of almost by definition oppressive in a sense. So this is inevitable. This is always there. It's always kind of part of the human condition. So I basically view the only response to that is to what extent can that be alleviated? To what extent can that be minimized? Of course, the way that it's normally addressed is usually just to double down on some alternative form of oppression. So if you say that a black was at one time mistreated, well, then the alternative form of oppression is you're not allowed to say anything negative ever about black people. Well, obviously that's a disproportionate and arguably more severe form of oppression. So I suppose the only antidote that I can see is to substitute as much as possible the need for control expressed in terms of these ideological norms, in terms of some kind of systematic approach. So in other words, there will always be the need to control, to regulate, to arbitrate grievances and things. But if you can do that in the least personal manner, I suppose that's the point at which you come furthest from oppression. So, for example, if instead of, say, one race seeing that another race performs differently and therefore has to be treated differently according to the rules, if you simply say, well, we have these very clear rules and we try to write them on the wall as explicitly as possible, and if you if under those rules you consistently do poorer than some other group, then too bad, get lost, essentially, because, our rules might not be perfect, but at least we have some kind of system that we're following. So the level of obnoxiousness, I suppose, is kept to a minimum by virtue of the sort of impersonality of the thing. So I think that really the furthest one gets from this sort of universal oppression is the extent to which control can be expressed through avenues other than intimate social ideological control, and can be more oriented or more expressed through institutions like the state or the market or some legal apparatus that at least creates a facsimile of some kind of reasonableness. So that's where I stand on that. I'll let that stand as my closing remarks.
All right. Not that this, of course, would exhaust any discussion of oppression. There's a lot we had to leave out, but I think this was thought-provoking and hopefully is a point for future discussions. Thanks again for contributing, Keith Preston, Swithun Dobson, Ruminations. This is Ty Lewis of the Praise of Five podcast, signing off.